The recording filled the courtroom without a single interruption. Everyone in that room, the jury, both sets of attorneys, the bailiffs, even Judge Patterson herself, went completely still. My son's voice came through the speakers clearly. "She doesn't know what she's signing half the time. Did you see her at dinner? She asked me twice what day it was." "Twice, Rachel. We just need the POA finalized, and then the investment accounts are accessible, all of them." Then Rachel's voice, smooth and careful the way it always was. "And the house too. Once we have medical authority, contesting the existing will becomes a procedural issue. My attorney says it takes maybe 6 weeks. What if he figures it out?" A pause, long enough that I counted 4 full seconds before my son answered. "He won't. He can barely remember what he had for breakfast." The recording ended. My attorney, a sharp woman named Diane Holloway, who'd spent 20 years prosecuting financial elder abuse cases, clicked off the audio player and turned to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "what you just heard was not a son concerned about his father's health. What you just heard was a man calculating how to steal a dying man's estate while that man was still very much alive." She paused. "Except, of course, for one problem. The man in question wasn't dying, wasn't confused, and had been recording every conversation in that house for the previous 5 months." She looked at my son. He heard every word. I watched my son's face in that moment, watched the color drain out of it, the way water drains from a bathtub, slow at first, then all at once. He turned to look at me from across the room, and I held his gaze without blinking. I'd spent 31 years as a cardiac surgeon. I'd looked into the faces of patients on operating tables and made decisions in seconds that determined whether they lived or died. I knew how to stay calm when everything around me was falling apart. He looked away first. "Let me go back to the beginning, because the ending only makes sense once you understand how it started. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 67 years old. I spent the better part of 4 decades at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee, first as a resident, then as an attending, then as head of cardiothoracic surgery for the last 11 years of my career. I retired 2 years ago, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. My hands were still steady. My mind was still sharp. I'd simply decided I'd given enough years to other people's hearts, and it was time to attend to my own life. My wife Caroline passed away 9 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, progressed fast. We had 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and I spent every one of those months either at her side or standing over someone else's open chest, wishing I were. After she died, I grieved the way surgeons grieve, quietly, privately, with the kind of controlled precision that people around you mistake for strength but is really just habit. My son Derek was 34 when I retired. He'd grown up watching me work 70-hour weeks and decided early on that medicine wasn't for him, which I respected. What he'd chosen instead was a string of business ventures that never quite became businesses, a talent for spending money that outpaced his talent for making it, and a rotating cast of women who seemed selected mostly for their enthusiasm in spending alongside him. Rachel was the latest. He'd been with her about 18 months when I first met her, at a dinner at my house in Brentwood, a 4-bedroom colonial on 2 acres that Caroline and I had bought 22 years earlier, and that I'd maintained meticulously ever since. Rachel was 31, attractive in the way that takes significant daily maintenance, and she had a way of looking around a room that wasn't quite admiration and wasn't quite appraisal, but landed somewhere uncomfortable in between. I noticed it. I didn't say anything. That was perhaps my first mistake, or perhaps it wasn't a mistake at all, just the first piece being set on the board. The trouble started gradually, the way trouble usually does. Derek began calling more often, which I initially took as a good sign. He'd always been somewhat distant since Caroline died, as if her death had introduced a formality between us that neither of us knew how to dissolve. So the increased contact felt like progress. But the calls had a pattern I started recognizing after the third or fourth one. He'd ask how I was feeling, ask whether I'd seen my doctor recently, mention with studied casualness that he'd read an article about early onset cognitive decline, and that I should really get a baseline assessment done, just to have on file, just to know. I'm a physician. I know exactly what a baseline cognitive assessment is, and why someone might want one on file. I started paying closer attention. Then came the visit. Derek called one Thursday in October to say that he and Rachel were in a rough spot financially, a real estate deal that had fallen through, some debts that had compounded, and asked if they could stay with me for a while, just to get back on their feet. I said yes. I said yes because he was my son, because Caroline would have said yes, and because I still believed, at that point, that the trouble was financial and temporary, and that what he needed was his father. They moved in 3 weeks later, with enough luggage to suggest they weren't planning on leaving quickly. I gave them the guest suite on the second floor. I told my housekeeper Margaret, who came 3 days a week, that we had guests. I tried to resume the ordinary rhythms of my retirement: morning coffee on the back porch, afternoon reading, the occasional round of golf with my friend Ray, who'd been my college roommate and was now a retired federal prosecutor, living 40 minutes away in Franklin. It was Ray, actually, who first said it plainly. We were sitting on his back deck in November, about 3 weeks after Derek and Rachel moved in, and I was describing some of the small things I'd noticed: the way Rachel asked about the house's value, about my investment portfolio, about whether I had a financial advisor, the way Derek had gently suggested, twice, that perhaps I should simplify my affairs, consolidate accounts, streamline my estate documents, maybe consider a trust structure that would make things easier to manage. Ray listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he set down his coffee cup. "Gerald," he said, "I spent 20 years prosecuting people who did exactly what you're describing. They target older individuals, usually recently widowed, or living alone, usually with significant assets. They establish proximity, manufacture concern about cognitive decline, and then push for legal instruments, power of attorney, guardianship, beneficiary changes, that give them financial control." End quote. I looked at him. "You think my son is running an elder financial abuse scheme?" "I think you should act like he might be," Ray said, "and find out for certain before you decide what to do about it." I drove home that evening and sat in Caroline's reading chair, the one I'd never moved from its spot by the living room window, and thought about it for a long time. Then I called a security consultant. His name was Marcus Webb, and Ray had used him before on federal cases. He came to the house while Derek and Rachel were out, swept it for existing recording devices, there were none, and installed a system of his own. Small, embedded in smoke detectors and electrical outlets, high-quality audio and video, all of it feeding to an encrypted cloud account only I could access. Marcus also helped me with the performance, because that's what the next 5 months became: a performance. I'm a surgeon, not an actor. But it turned out the two skills had more in common than I'd expected. Both required sustained focus over long periods. Both required maintaining absolute control of your external presentation while managing whatever you were feeling internally. Both required making other people believe you were doing one thing while you were actually doing another. I began forgetting small things. Not dramatically. I wasn't going to insult my son's intelligence by pretending I didn't know my own name. Small things. Asking what day it was. Losing my reading glasses, which I then started leaving in obvious places for them to find and return to me. Repeating a question I'd asked 30 minutes earlier. Getting briefly confused about a medication dosage. Derek and Rachel noticed. Of course they noticed. They were watching for it. The conversations changed. They became more frequent, more probing. Rachel started asking about my doctor. Which doctor? How often did I see him? Had I thought about a full geriatric workup? Derek brought up power of attorney twice in November, framing it as simple practicality. Just sensible planning, Dad, in case something happened so I wouldn't have to worry. I said I'd think about it. I also, in October, had a very quiet meeting with my actual attorney, a woman named Susan Park, who had handled my affairs for 12 years. We updated my will. I transferred a meaningful portion of my liquid assets to a charitable remainder trust I'd been considering funding for years. I specified in writing that Derek was to receive a fixed sum, enough to be comfortable, not enough to be idle, and that the remainder of my estate, including the house, would go to a cardiovascular research foundation at Vanderbilt that Caroline had supported, and that I'd funded in her name after she died. Susan asked if I was certain. I told her I was. I also told her to keep the updated documents entirely confidential, seen only by her and the 2 witnesses she trusted most, not filed anywhere Derek could access, not discussed with anyone outside her office. Then I went home and forgot out loud what I'd had for breakfast. December arrived, and with it a shift in urgency. Derek and Rachel were spending money I hadn't authorized. I reviewed my accounts carefully and found 3 charges on a credit card I rarely used that I hadn't made myself. Small amounts, nothing that screamed fraud, but deliberate. Testing the water, seeing if I'd notice, I didn't mention it. In January, Derek sat me down for a serious conversation. He was concerned, he said. I seemed to be struggling more than I was letting on. He'd done some research, talked to a doctor, a geriatric specialist, he said, and thought it would be best if we formally established a healthcare directive and a durable power of attorney, just to make sure that if something happened, he could take care of things. He slid a document across the kitchen table. I looked at it. It was a general, durable power of attorney, the kind that, once signed, would give Derek authority over my financial accounts, my property transactions, my investment decisions, essentially everything. I picked it up, looked at it for a long moment. "This seems complicated," I said. "It's really not, Dad. It's just paperwork to protect you. I'd want to have someone look at it. Of course, we can have someone look at it, but honestly, the sooner we get this sorted out, the better. These things can take time to process, and you don't want to be caught without coverage if something—" "Let me hold on to it," I said. "I'll read it tonight." He hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, of course." I took the document upstairs and read every line of it. It was exactly what it appeared to be, a broad, sweeping grant of financial authority, the kind of document that, in the hands of someone with bad intentions, would let them liquidate a person's assets entirely and move the proceeds with minimal legal resistance. I photographed every page and sent the photos to Susan. Then I went back downstairs, left the document on the kitchen counter where I'd found my glasses that morning, and told Derek I couldn't remember where I'd put it. I watched his jaw tighten just slightly before he smoothed it back into concern. That was when I knew, with the same certainty I used to feel when a diagnosis clicked into place, that Ray had been right from the beginning. I called him the next morning from my car, parked at the end of the driveway. "We need to move," I said. Ray agreed. He'd already been in quiet contact with a former colleague at the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Given my status as a retired physician and the nature of the scheme, it was the kind of case that drew attention. Within 2 weeks, I was formally cooperating with a federal investigation. The recordings were already substantial. Marcus reviewed them with the investigating agent, a woman named Tanya Osei, who specialized in elder financial exploitation. What they found was worse than I'd anticipated. It wasn't just Derek and Rachel. There was a third person, a man named Paul Griffith, a disbarred attorney from Memphis who specialized in producing fraudulent legal documents. Derek had been in contact with him since October. The plan, as reconstructed from the recordings and Griffith's own communications, which were later subpoenaed, was layered. First, establish the POA. Second, use it to redirect my liquid assets, roughly $2.1 million across several investment accounts, into a holding company Rachel had incorporated in Nevada 2 months before moving in with me. Third, initiate a challenge to my existing will on grounds of cognitive incapacity, using a fraudulent geriatric assessment that Griffith had connections to produce. The house was to be sold through a legitimate transaction that Derek would control through the POA, at fair market value, just under $1.4 million, with the proceeds flowing entirely to him. The total they were planning to take was somewhere around $3.5 million. Agent Osei sat across from me in Ray's living room and laid all of this out in the flat, methodical way investigators have, and I listened to every word without interrupting. When she finished, I asked her one question. How long to build the full case? We're close, she said. We need one more overt act, something on record. I'll give you one. 2 weeks later, I told Derek I'd thought about the power of attorney and I was ready to sign it. I told him I wanted to do it at the house, with him and Rachel present, that I didn't want to make a production of it. He agreed immediately, too quickly, but I'd expected that. The signing was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. What Derek didn't know was that Susan Park's assistant had tipped off Tanya Osei's team that morning. What he also didn't know was that the man he'd hired to serve as second witness to the signing, a formality meant to make everything look legitimate, was already cooperating with federal investigators. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same one where Derek had first slid the document toward me 3 months earlier. I picked up the pen, then I set it down. Before I sign this, I said, I want to make sure I understand what I'm giving you. Derek said patiently that we'd been over it. It was just a precaution. But the investment accounts, this covers those. Yes, Dad. The house? Yes, but nothing's going to change. This is just so that if you're ever in a situation where you need someone to, and you and Rachel would manage everything together. Something shifted in Rachel's expression, just briefly. We'd take care of everything, she said. You wouldn't have to worry about any of it. Okay, I said, and I signed. Tanya Osei's team came through the front door 9 minutes later. Federal charges were filed 5 weeks after the arrest. 3 counts for Derek: financial elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, and forgery, the last one connected to documents Paul Griffith had already partially produced. Rachel faced 2 counts, conspiracy and fraud. Griffith, who decided quickly that cooperation was in his own interest, pled guilty to 2 charges and agreed to testify for the prosecution. I watched Derek in the courtroom during the preliminary hearing, watched him in his suit, a suit I recognized, one I'd bought him for his cousin's wedding 4 years earlier, and tried to find the 22-year-old I'd taught to drive a manual transmission in an empty parking lot in Green Hills. I couldn't locate him. The man sitting at that defense table was a stranger wearing my son's face. His attorney, a man named Calloway, was aggressive and had spent 15 years doing exactly this kind of defense work: complex financial cases, white-collar crime, clients with resources, and a story to tell. He filed a motion to suppress the recordings on Fourth Amendment grounds. The judge denied it. I had consented to the recording system in my own home, and the law was clear. He argued that Derek had genuinely believed I was experiencing cognitive decline, and had been acting out of concern. Tanya Osei dismantled that with 6 months of recorded conversations in which Derek and Rachel discussed my confusion in terms that made their actual intentions unmistakable. There was a moment about halfway through the trial when Calloway called me to the stand. I'd been expecting it. Diane had prepared me for the angle he was likely to take. He started from a reasonable distance. How long had Derek and I had a close relationship? Had I ever struggled with the demands of single parenthood after Caroline's death? Wasn't it possible that Derek's questions about my health came from a place of genuine love and worry? I answered carefully and honestly. Yes, we'd been close. Yes, single parenthood had been difficult. And yes, it was possible that concern could have been the starting point. Then Calloway leaned forward. Dr. Whitmore, isn't it true that you spent 5 months deliberately deceiving your own son, that you manufactured symptoms of cognitive decline specifically to induce him to act in ways you could later use against him. I documented his actions, I said. There's a difference. You performed. Your own word. You told the investigator, you treated it like a performance. You're a doctor. You used your medical knowledge to convincingly simulate illness. I created an environment in which my son's genuine intentions could reveal themselves. He was never coerced into a single choice he made, but you gave him no opportunity to come to you directly, to say, "Dad, I'm in financial trouble, I need help." You bypassed all of that and went straight to a federal investigation. I looked at him steadily. He was in my house, I said. He ate at my table for 5 months. He had every opportunity in the world to come to me directly. Instead, I recorded him telling Rachel that the key was getting the POA finalized before I figured out what was happening. I paused. "Mr. Calloway, I'm a cardiac surgeon. I spent 31 years making fast, precise decisions about whether to cut. The one skill you develop above all others in that work is the ability to distinguish between a patient who can be saved and a situation that requires a different kind of intervention entirely." Calloway had nothing to follow that with. He sat down. The jury deliberated for 4 days. 4 days I spent at Ray's house, mostly on his back porch, drinking coffee, playing cards, and trying not to think about what 12 strangers in a room were deciding about my son's future. On the 4th afternoon, Ray's phone rang. He listened for a moment, then looked at me. "Verdict," he said. The courtroom was more crowded than I'd expected. The case had drawn attention. Retired surgeon, federal fraud charges, a son and his girlfriend, the kind of story that travels. I sat in the front row with Susan Park on one side and Ray on the other, and watched Derek and Rachel come in, and watched the jury file into their seats. The foreperson was a man in his 60s, a retired schoolteacher, with the kind of quiet, deliberate manner I'd decided I liked during jury selection. Judge Patterson asked for the verdict on the charge of financial elder abuse against Derek Whitmore. Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud. Guilty. On the charge of forgery. Guilty. Derek's attorney put a hand on his arm. Derek didn't move. Rachel's charges came next. Guilty on conspiracy. Guilty on fraud. I watched her face. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she was staring at the table in front of her, and whatever she was feeling, she'd decided not to let anyone see it. The sentencing hearing came 3 weeks later. Calloway argued for leniency. Derek had no prior criminal history. He'd been under financial stress. His relationship with Rachel had introduced an outside influence, and the actual harm had been limited, since no money had ever actually been transferred. The POA had been executed, but immediately voided, and my assets were fully intact. Diane's response was measured and exact. "Your Honor, the argument that attempted theft isn't punishable because the theft was interrupted is not one this court should dignify with extended consideration." Derek Whitmore spent 6 months systematically targeting his own father, a 67-year-old man living alone, a retired physician who had lost his wife and was, according to the defendant's own recorded statements, believed to be experiencing cognitive decline. The fact that the father was not actually declining and had in fact anticipated and documented everything does not diminish the nature of the intent. It simply meant justice was still available. She let that land. Mr. Whitmore knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it was wrong. He did it anyway. And he continued doing it, escalating it, recruiting additional co-conspirators for 6 months. The sentence should reflect that. Judge Patterson sentenced Derek to 12 years in federal prison. Rachel received 8 years. Paul Griffith, who had cooperated fully, received 3 years and was ordered to surrender his remaining assets. Joint restitution was ordered in the amount of $340,000, legal fees, investigative costs, emotional damages. Between them, they had almost nothing to cover it with. Whatever they did have would follow them for years. After sentencing, as the courtroom cleared and reporters gathered near the doors, I walked over to where Derek stood with a federal marshal waiting to take him out. He looked at me. There was still anger in his eyes, and underneath it, finally, something that might have been shame. I didn't give the anger anywhere to land. "I want you to hear something," I said quietly, "because I want you to understand it, not as a punishment, but as a fact." He waited. "The house will be sold this summer. The investment accounts, the ones you spent 6 months trying to reach, are being dissolved and redistributed. Half to the Caroline Whitmore Cardiovascular Research Fund at Vanderbilt. The rest to a foundation that provides legal assistance to elderly people who are victims of exactly what you tried to do to me." I paused. "The money you wanted is going to help people like me protect themselves from people like you." He stared at me, his mouth opening slightly. "That wasn't revenge," I said. "That was always the plan. Your mother and I decided years ago that this is where it should go. You just accelerated the timeline." The marshal touched his arm. He didn't move for a moment. "I taught you better than this," I said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was just true, and I needed to say it before I walked away." Then I walked away. Ray drove me home that evening. We stopped for dinner at a place on Fifth Avenue we'd been going to for 20 years, a quiet Italian restaurant where the owner knew us by name and never asked questions. We ate pasta, split half a bottle of wine, and talked about ordinary things: his grandchildren, my golf handicap, a book we'd both been meaning to get around to. Outside, the April air was cool and clean, Nashville in spring. I put the house on the market 6 weeks after sentencing. It sold in 11 days, slightly over asking, to a family relocating from Chicago. I watched them walk through it on inspection day, a couple in their late 30s with 2 kids who ran through the rooms making the kind of noise those walls hadn't heard in years. Good, I remember thinking. Good. I bought something smaller in East Nashville, closer to Vanderbilt, closer to the foundation office where I'd started volunteering as an advisor. 3 bedrooms, a shaded front porch, a backyard with an old oak tree I liked immediately. Everything else, every dollar, every account, went exactly where it had always been meant to go. The morning I moved in, I sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee and watched the street wake up. A woman walked by, pushing a stroller. 2 men went jogging past. Somebody a few doors down was out working in their garden. My phone stayed quiet in my pocket, and for the first time in a long while, that quiet didn't feel like something to worry about. I thought about Derek. I still do, more often than I probably let on, and I suspect that won't change for the rest of my life. I thought about him at 10 years old, convinced he'd broken our family's ornament-hanging record. I thought about him standing next to me at Caroline's funeral, in a suit that was slightly too big, working hard not to cry. I thought about every year between that morning and the afternoon he sat across from me and slid a piece of paper across the kitchen table. I don't know exactly which turn in the road brought him to that moment. Greed, fear, Rachel's influence, or simply his own choices, made over and over until they hardened into who he was. Maybe there was a moment I missed, somewhere back along the way, where I could have caught it. I've spent enough nights with that question to know it isn't one I'll ever fully answer. What I do know is that I gave him chances, real ones, not the performance, not the theater of the last 5 months, but genuine openings, every single day, to knock on my door and say, "Dad, I need help." To just be honest, to be the person I'd raised him to be. He chose differently, every day, on his own. All I did was make sure those choices came with consequences. That wasn't cruelty. By the end, it was the only thing I had left to give him. My phone buzzed. Ray, checking in. "How's the new place?" I looked out at the oak tree. A cardinal had settled into the upper branches. "Good," I typed back. "Really good." I set the phone down and finished my coffee. I had a meeting that afternoon at the foundation, a new estate planning education program for seniors I'd been helping design for a couple of months. Simple guides, plain language, the kind of thing that might help 100 other people avoid the road I'd just come through. After that, dinner with my daughter Meredith, who lived 40 minutes away in Murfreesboro and had driven up the day before to help me unpack, and who I'd caught crying quietly in the kitchen once when she thought I wasn't looking. I was a 67-year-old retired heart surgeon, living alone in a smaller house on a street I was still learning, starting over in the particular way that only becomes possible once you've lost something you can't get back and decided to build again anyway from whatever's left. It wasn't the chapter I would have written for myself, but the cardinal was still up in the oak tree, the coffee was still warm, and the morning was still quiet. There are worse places to start from than that.